Hello and welcome back to the IEA channel. I'm Emily Carver, Head of Media at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I'm joined by Sam Bowman, Director of Competition Policy at the International Centre for Law and Economics and a Senior Fellow at the Adam Smith Institute, Tom Slater, Deputy Editor of Spiked Online, commentator and self-professed free speech fan, and Marc Glendening, the IEA's new Head of Cultural Affairs. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Now, big tech has been the subject of heated debate over recent days and weeks, sparked by Twitter's decision to suspend the former president of the United States, Donald Trump. They justified the move on the grounds that following the events at Capitol Hill, there was a risk of further incitement of violence. Many rejoiced at the news, while many others voiced their concerns over the growing power of tech giants to censor speech. The story didn't stop there. In little more than 24 hours, Google, Amazon, and Apple had removed free speech alternative social network Parler from their own platforms. I believe as we speak, the site is still inaccessible. Now, legally speaking, these private companies are well within their rights to set their own rules on who is and who isn't allowed to use their sites. And companies like Google are in their rights to select what apps they will and will not host. But what are the consequences of this action? And should we be concerned about the precedent it sets? Clearly, Twitter has not applied its rules in an even-handed fashion, with egregious tweets from the Chinese embassy left up for days and a tweet from Iran's supreme leader encouraging the eradication of Israel still very much available online. Has big tech shot itself in the foot as the debate over whether these sites are platforms or publishers intensifies? Surely removing Donald Trump is a prime example of big tech acting as a publisher, not a platform, as they have insisted they are for many years. Will big tech come to regret this heavy-handed approach? Sam, let me start with you. Do you agree with people who say, well, they're private companies, they should be allowed to run their services as they see fit? And does this argument still hold up when there's not really any real alternative social media platforms available and little prospect of competitors maybe taking their place if other infrastructure providers refuse to support them, like Google and Amazon have done?
Well, thanks very much for having me. That is a huge question, so apologies if I don't respond on every item. On the Parler point first, I think we should just be really clear about the facts. Amazon's policy, AWS, the web host section of Amazon's policy, is not that it will remove a service that carries user-generated content that threatens violence. It's that if you don't put in any measures to moderate that content, then and it becomes a problem, then they have the right to withdraw the service. So Parler wasn't just carrying, threats of violence, people talking about lynching politicians and people like that. The problem wasn't just that Parler was carrying that content. It was that Parler was doing virtually nothing to moderate that content. It was a big service. It was one that was gaining lots and lots of users, and it had no plan put in place to control, and pretty horrifying stuff. I can read out some of the things, but one example, this Stacey Abrams will be good target practice for our beginners. This should be hung for betraying her country. These are things. Sorry for the bad language, but we need to be.
I'll have to censor
clear
you there, Sam.
You can if you want, but I mean, then perhaps that makes you a publisher, and then you become responsible for everything else I say, according to some people. I think it's important to be aware of what was on here. There was a lot of this, and Parler was doing nothing to censor it. So the first question is: does a service like Amazon, does a web hosting service like Amazon, have the right to withdraw its services from a client that is in breach of contract, and that is in breach of contract by hosting a very large amount of very, very violent or kind of content that's promoting violence? In my opinion, yes. I think that the second point is, and your question sort of hinted at this, or your question sort of got to this, is what are the alternatives of a service like Parler? Now, actually, in this case, I don't think it's a huge problem if no hosting service wants to host Parler. As it happens, Parler did actually find a host, a company called Epic, which also hosts Gab and which hosts other things. When it comes to hosting, in fact, it's possible to self-host. Of all of the kind of different levels of the stack, of the tech stack, hosting is kind of one of the things that is most easy to go to and find an alternative provider or do yourself if you need to. The way I think we should think about free speech, and I'll kind of try to finish my remarks here to let others have a say. The way I think we should try to think about free speech is about capacity. It's about how much capacity do you have to express your views in a way that other people can hear them. That, I think, is a very different conception of free speech to the one that many people have, which is about rights and which is about you should be able to say anything you want, blah, 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 under any circumstances. Because I think that the latter one is kind of deficient because it doesn't capture the kinds of questions that we're talking about here. When we think in terms of rights, it's pretty obvious to me that I have the right to not allow you into my house, even if you have something really important to say to me, even if it's a political message that you really, really want me to hear, and maybe it'd be really important for me to hear it. I think I have the right to not allow you in. And I think that an analogous right is that of Amazon or Twitter to not allow people into their property, onto their websites they don't want. But I do think that if we take the capacities view, we can say that it's still a meaningful curb on people's freedom of speech, on people's ability to say the things they want to say when they are denied access to some service or when they are denied access to somebody's house. I don't think that has straightforward legal implications because I don't think it's possible to. It's a kind of constant trade-off in terms of different, priorities. People's right to their property, the value of people being able to make themselves heard to other people. There is no straightforward legal implication of this, but to me, it's a much more useful way of thinking about the trade-offs of companies and people exercising their property rights than the idea that you have an absolute right to always express your opinion in a way that makes other people able to hear it, because clearly that clashes with other extremely important rights as well.
Sure. Tom, what's your view on what Sam's just said? Can you see that side of things, or are you more of the view that this is shutting down debate and this is where so much of our political discourse is happening, that these companies are now exerting far more power than even some governments have on the way that we express ourselves and by censoring in this way? What's your view?
No, I think that big tech censorship is a huge problem for free speech, democratic debate, and how we kind of tangibly actually, exercise that in the modern era. And I think we cannot compare platforms which have, in excess of 2.5 billion users to someone's house. It's a fundamentally kind of different sort of space, which in some way, shape or form does resemble a kind of digital public square, or a portion of the digital public square. Sam's own personal page might be more analogous to his house potentially, but it's quite clear that this is a space in which people discuss ideas, in which people speak their minds, in which political campaigning takes place. So I think, therefore, we need to take the threat of big tech censorship very, very seriously. We've already talked about the Parler example, which I think does raise serious questions about the ability of any free speech alternative to be set up, not least because it wasn't just kicked off of Amazon. Obviously, there was this kind of contagion which happened whereby any companies in relation to payments or all these other things, we've gone from saying, if you don't like Twitter or Facebook, you can leave and join or set up an alternative, to you also have to set up your own web servers, you have to set up your own payments, all these kinds of things. It's a slightly different prospect. But I think there's two specific actions which have been taken, which I think speak to not just the kind of censorship of freedom of speech, as it were, but also meddling in democratic politics, full stop, that we've seen in recent months, that we have to take very, very seriously. So we've already talked a bit about the banning of Donald Trump, which we have to recognize was a huge reach, even in terms of what Silicon Valley was previously comfortable with. For a very long time, there was this line that they wouldn't cross, which was to say that when you have an elected official, the president no less, leader of the free world, that what they say therefore should gain some level of kind of special protection. The fact that they felt willing to overstep that line and kind of get between a president and his people in that respect, in what now constitutes a portion of what is the public square, I think was very alarming. The other very alarming example, which again we saw Twitter and Facebook acting in very similar ways around the same time, was when the Hudson Biden expose ran in the New York Post back in October, I think it was, in the run-up to the election, this kind of mudslinging expose. People obviously questioned the provenance of it and what have you, but nevertheless the reaction, I think, was pretty stark and unlike anything that we've seen before. This was labelled misinformation. Twitter stopped it from being shared. Facebook suppressed its spread. And when you also put that alongside all of the other deeply conspiratorial things that have been said in relation to the 2016 election, you do see a double standard here. Now, my point is not that these things are easy. I mean, the problem when you're talking about what to do about big tech or the internet is that most of the people pushing some sort of proposal for either legal or regulatory reform want less free speech, not more. That's very, very clear from many of the proposals which have come forward at the moment. But I still think that we, A, can't discount the idea in and of itself, that there's things to be explored, and B, that we just have to recognise that freedom of speech cannot just be a kind of narrow legal right as we might have previously understood it. That people who have thought deeply about the issues of free thought and free speech have recognised that it's a more expansive thing than that. You know, John Stuart Mill talking about the extent to which there are other means than civil penalties through which a society can enforce conformity. And in the form of big tech, where we have a huge concentration of not just social and political power, but economic power as well, we're seeing a very serious means through which that conformity can be enforced. And I think the first step to finding a solution to this is recognising that is a problem, because there's far too many people, either because they're gleaning to free speech as a narrow legal right, or they're people on the left who just want to fell their opponents and then therefore become incredibly comfortable with billionaires, exacting their will unilaterally. We need to recognise how much of a serious problem that is, because that's the first step to at least trying to address some of these questions.
Marc, I mean, censorship and blacklisting has been a tool that's been used by authoritarian states to silence political enemies. Should we be equally concerned by censorship from these big tech companies as we might be from big government?
Okay. The reality is, I think it's, with all due respect, a slightly academic question, because I think there is really zilch, the British state, even if it had the ideological desire to take on the big tech companies in support of free speech. There's no leverage there. The government is doing quite good stuff in relation to higher education now, belatedly, but there it has the capacity potentially to withdraw accreditation, to withhold public money, and the same applies in a different context to the BBC. There is absolutely nothing, I think, in reality. I mean, perhaps the two other speakers, who I'm sure know much more about the logistics of the internet than I do, but it seems to me there's virtually nothing the British government can do to hold Amazon and the others to account, even if it wanted to. That's not to say there's nothing, we can do about this. It seems to me, to use that awful new left, wokey expression, we can call out these companies, and perhaps there is an argument for a concerted international campaign to be directed on these companies to try to communicate some sort of countervailing pressure. So, for example, one idea might be an international free speech charter, which all the tech companies would be challenged to sign up to, which would be incredibly reasonable and would give them the right to exclude the kind of people that Sam was talking about. So that's not to say there's nothing we can't do, but I think that the more fundamental problem is that what might be described as new left authoritarian ideas now have a complete cultural stranglehold. And it is extraordinary, is it not, that virtually all the employees in Silicon Valley seem to adhere to the same political worldview. They're all kind of neo-McCarthyites of the left. And as a consequence, until we can address this fundamentally cultural problem as to why small L liberal values are not really adhered to by so many higher educated, younger generation people, then I think this is a slightly academic area of debate. But there were a couple of points I wanted to come back really on Sam, who I thought made a fascinating distinction between rights and capacity. And it doesn't seem to me that the two are mutually exclusive. I may have misunderstood you, but my understanding is that a philosophical defense of the right of human beings to articulate whatever it is they want to articulate in a political context does ultimately depend upon a notion of rights. It does ultimately depend upon a notion of what it is to be a human being and the rights we then have over our own mental and physical capacities in relation to that. And that relationship is fundamentally between ourselves and the state. But there is another type of relationship, which is between the individual and the rest of society, civil society. And I think you're absolutely right that, you know, I don't have a right to go to Chelsea football ground and shout whatever abuse I want to at Raheem Sterling. That is a private environment. And as with, you know, the Ritz restaurant or something, I have to abide by the rules of that institution if I want access to that particular place. But that's quite a different argument from saying that the state has the right to inhibit me in other contexts, within my own home, for example, or with you know, a grouping of people who voluntarily come together. I do believe I have a right in that context to say whatever it is I want to say.
I think you should have that right. Yeah, I think so. I think that we can say that with respect to law, something akin to a First Amendment, which, remember, the First Amendment just refers to what the state can do. Something akin basically creates a legal right that the state may not stop you from saying things that you want to say, with a few exceptions. We can also say that it would be good if other individuals allowed you to, as much as is sort of reasonable and tolerable to them, to express your opinions and kind of give you the benefit of the doubt. So, for example, we might think that it's reasonable for a pub to say, nobody's allowed to talk about politics in here. We might also think that it would be good if the pub didn't have that rule. Clearly the pub should be allowed to have that rule, but we might think that from a point of view of people being able to express themselves, it would be better if the pub didn't have that rule. And that's a kind of a thought experiment that, to kind of go back to Tom's point, I don't really agree that Twitter is like a public square, because Twitter isn't the only place that we have to talk. Twitter is one place, but most people do not. I mean, a very, very small number of people actually use Twitter for politics. Most people who use Twitter use it for like football, TV, and think people like us are total weirdos. Most people get their politics through things like newspapers, newspaper websites, Facebook, YouTube. Basically, there are lots of different ways that people can express themselves. So to me, that's really relevant, because I think the market for expression of views is actually quite broad and competitive. And so I think that there are two different scenarios we can think about. One is a village that has 10 pubs, with one pub saying nobody's allowed to talk about politics in here. The other is a village that only has one pub, where that one pub says nobody's allowed to talk about politics in here, and there aren't other places for people to kind of meet and talk with each other. To me, I'm completely relaxed about the first village. I think it's really not a big deal at all. In fact, it's really good, because I would go to that pub. I would much prefer to go to the pub where people aren't allowed to talk about politics, but it's great that the people who do want to do that can go to another pub. In the second scenario, where there is basically no other option, where there's no other space for people to talk, it's much more troubling to have that rule. And I'm still not necessarily saying we should have a law against it, but I think it's probably a bad thing for the world for that pub to pass that rule. To me, the question that we should be answering is Twitter more like a pub in a village with 10 other alternatives, or a pub where there is no other alternative? And I think that it's much more like the former. Having said that, I think there are services, and actually I think card payment services, as we've seen at the Pornhub kind of shutdown, are a good example of basically kind of quasi-monopolistic in their ability to restrict speech and affect speech. And I think that those are the sorts of services, it's that layer of the stack that we should be more concerned. And I think app stores are more like that, but for as long as the World Wide Web exists, and for as long as people can still, in a slightly more inconvenient way, access the same kind of content through their web browser on their phone, I'm less concerned. But it's closer to being like that than the Twitter example.
But Sam, I'm sure Tom will come back on this as well, but Sam, aren't you being slightly disingenuous there? Because Trump, so much of his conversation with his supporters and with the world was conducted on Twitter. You can't really say, oh, well, he could use another platform and it would be exactly the same. You are curtailing that political process in that way by
I'm certainly
removing the man. Also, I would just argue that it appears to me that these tech guys in Silicon Valley have got a bit of a god complex. They pay lip service to democracy, but I think they fundamentally believe that they deserve this power to control the way we conduct our discussion. And the fact that they have so much power over the way we conduct our discussion surely is of a concern. Tom,
well, on the Trump point, I think it's certainly cramps Trump's style to not be able to use Twitter. But Trump, of all the people in the world, as a former president of the United States, has much more ability to communicate with people through other channels than so for example, I do, or perhaps you do. I think it would be a more significant reduction in your ability or my ability to express ourselves, to have our Twitter accounts banned, than and we would always be able to just come back, maybe, I don't know, but than his. It certainly cramps his style. I'm not saying it doesn't affect him in any way. I just don't think that his sort of style not being cramped is a massively important thing that we should care about. On the second point, I don't really know what I don't personally think they do have a god complex, incidentally, but I do think that people only really think about this point that I've seen made by a guy called Roberto Mariani earlier last week. He basically pointed out it's really difficult to build an alternative to Twitter. It's really difficult to build an alternative to Google search. It's really difficult to build an alternative to these things because they're very, very big, sophisticated services. Now, to me, that's an argument in favor of allowing those services to be run in the way that they want to be run, because it's really difficult to run them. Because building a service like Twitter or building an app like Instagram requires an enormous amount of investment, an enormous amount of smart managerial decision making, an enormous amount of vision. And we should be respectful. And I don't mean respectful in a kind of deferential way. We should realize that the amount of work and the difficulty of building those services means that interfering with them and coming along and saying we're going to regulate you, I feel exactly the same way about coming into any innovative company and the government saying we're going to regulate you because we don't think that your products are environmentally friendly enough, or we don't think that your staffing decisions are equitable enough. I think all of those things come with very, very significant unforeseen consequences and very, very, very significant trade-offs in terms of reduced innovation and reduced ability of those companies to improve their product for their consumers. So I don't really care if they have a god complex or not, but I do think these are really good services, and I'm very, very wary of the right saying, well, you're not being basically politically correct enough because you're censoring people that we like. So we're going to regulate you. It's no different to the left coming in and saying, well, we think that you should be hiring more of this group of people, or we think you should be paying higher wages, so we're going to regulate you in this way. Mm-hmm. Both come with massive unforeseen consequences, and I think it's a kind of planner's fallacy to think that you can interfere and change the way they run themselves without really big costs.
I think that's putting far too much trust in the bosses of these companies myself.
Well, I think you may be putting too much trust in the regulator or in the government.
But I would say that if we are concerned by big government, we should be equally concerned by big tech, I would argue, with the power that they have, which could, grow larger than governments.
See, the reason I disagree, and I know I talked a lot, but the reason
I need to bring it
there's an important difference. Big government does not and cannot have competitors. Big government is always a monopoly because it has a monopoly on the use of violence. Big tech does not have a monopoly on the use of violence. Google and Facebook and Apple do not have monopolies on violence, and in fact, they don't really have monopolies on the things that they're very good at creating. Because if you come up with a better version of the things that they create, it's pretty easy for you to win customers and to compete with them. So I think it's really important to recognize that even though they're big, they can't put you in jail for trying to compete with them. The government can do that and will do that. So I think they're very, very different and very importantly different levels of power. And I'm much more concerned about the ability to put people in jail and to prevent any competitor from existing than one that happens to be big because it's popular at the moment.
Mm. Now, just quickly to come back on some of Sam's points there, because I think if we were talking about, say, Twitter and exclusion of everything else, that's a different kind of argument. You know, Twitter is what, 300 million or so users and some change. And whereas you talk about something like Facebook, you know, what, 2.7 billion active monthly users, these are quantitatively different kind of animals, I think we can understand. But when you also look at each of the kind of big free speech, big tech censorship scandals, you have a herding of all of these platforms, at least the ones who, broadly speaking, we come to think of as Silicon Valley. So if you look at the Donald Trump decision, he wasn't just removed from Twitter, he was also removed from Facebook, he was also removed from YouTube, which was another, you know, competitor that you mentioned there. Similarly, any of the kind of big controversies around hate speech, conspiracy theorists, all these people have been booted off these platforms, which seem to kind of ramp up, particularly kind of 2015, 2016 onwards. Again, you see these platforms acting more or less as one. Now, do I think this is a kind of conspiracy amongst them, that they're all getting together to make these decisions? No, I don't. But picking up on the point that Marc made, they are all of a similar mindset. They're all, generally speaking, of a certain understanding as to what is and isn't acceptable on, if you like, the kind of big mainstream platforms. And therefore that has a material impact on the ability, not just of these high profile individuals, but as it cascades down to individual users, our ability to discuss these issues. And the thing is, in relation to the question of property rights and free speech rights, the thing is, even outside the tech context, these things have been in conflict, even in the US, which obviously has very strong free speech protections, but also very strong property rights tradition. You know, there was a Supreme Court ruling in the 40s or 50s that if I can remember correctly, which was about the question of, if you have a company town, it's effectively private property, its main street is private property, but still people having free speech rights extended to be able to express themselves in that forum. There's been a series of decisions with kind of slightly mixed results around the question of whether or not people are allowed to picket certain shops or protest if they're within something resembling a shopping mall. I'm not trying to say these are directly analogous, but nevertheless, there are points at which, when you have what is effectively private property or a private company occupying a space that we would consider something to be more in the stream of a public square, that slightly different rules apply. And frankly, I think if we're agonizing over the private property rights of these billionaires over the speech rights of ordinary citizens, then our priorities are a little bit screwed up. And I think we need to start exploring some of these things. And of course, we can make distinctions in all of this. There's some people who suggest that if you're in a situation in which you try to, I don't know, reform Section 230 in the US to bring it in line with First Amendment principles, as some people have suggested, then that's basically going to destroy all kinds of platforms which might be much smaller and might serve a certain kind of niche. If you've got a platform or a discussion forum or whatever, which is fundamentally devoted to people discussing or sharing pictures of their kids, it's obviously absurd to be in a situation where some QAnon type has a right to bound in there and start bombarding them with what it is that they think. But we can make distinctions. You know, liberal thought makes distinctions between different kinds of spaces which might be accessed by the public but serve different kind of purposes. You know, a public toilet and a public square are both allowed to be accessed by the public. They serve very different purposes. And I think even though there are very difficult, tricky questions about how any of this would be tackled on a legal or regulatory level, we should get in a second to the ways in which many countries are doing it wrong and are proposing to do it very wrong, as we've seen from some of Ursula von der Leyen's comments yesterday as well. But at the same time, I think we need to recognise that there is a conflict here. And if we're interested in freedom of speech, again, not just as in that kind of narrow legal sense, but as a principle which is really important to us being able to discuss ideas, to sort truth from illusion, you know, to challenge ideas we dislike, all of those arguments that we're all very familiar with, then we need to look at this space very seriously and to recognise that it does constitute something that a little bit different.
Marc, would you like to come in on any of that?
Yeah, well, I'd like to, ask the three of you really a question which has arisen in my head from hearing the various comments. At the moment, it's the likes of Donald Trump and Tommy Robinson and what have you, who are the principal targets for the big tech companies. But I'd be interested to know if you think that there's a sort of self-expanding dynamic within the ideology that is fueling this new authoritarianism. And as to whether, in fact, in time, it will gravitate, to the Spikes, to the Brett Weinsteins and others, simply because they are advocating freedom of speech. we see now with Black Lives Matters and other groups that simply articulating the belief that people should have the freedom to express whatever views they want to express on sort of culture wars issues is taken and defined as being a way of facilitating white supremacy, the patriarchy, and so on and so forth. They don't accept the conception of neutrality, let alone the idea that other people should be free to articulate beliefs, because they fundamentally see speech as a form of coercive power. So do you think it's possible that in time we will see this type of censorship, speech prohibition, gravitating away from the likes of Richard Spencer and the alt-right and all those kind of people, but actually in time they'll come to target the free speech liberal advocates?
What's your view on that, Sam? Are you worried that this is driven by political preferences and orthodoxy and ideology, or do you think this is simply just a business question, really? They're trying to avoid regulation down the line by seeming to self-regulate in this way?
I think it's probably a bit of both. Mark, to answer your question, I think yes, probably we will begin to see, I think we already are seeing that to some extent on sites like Twitter and YouTube. I'm probably less concerned by that than probably the rest of you are, because I think that the response is to go to a different site, and basically the service is it's like a company has raised its prices. I don't see any reason to prevent me if users want to access a version of Twitter that doesn't have that kind of censorship. I don't see a barrier to an open Twitter, or a kind of, I mean, Mastodon is the open source version, but a kind of a version of Twitter that does the same thing as Twitter, but doesn't remove, alt-right accounts or free speech accounts or whatever it might be. I'm certainly not saying they're the same thing. But I think that gets me to what I think is probably the third possibility as to the biggest motivation in doing this, which isn't the whims of the staff, because, I mean, these are profit-making companies in the end, and I mean, maybe they're satisfying their staff's whims instead of paying them money. That's one possibility. I think that's fair enough if they want to do that. But I think it's maybe they're trying to avoid regulation down the line, although maybe I don't know that they're doing a very good job of that. I think the third option is that they're responding to their users' demands, which are, most users, including myself, don't want to work on a completely unmoderated Twitter. And most users of these platforms want degrees of moderation and want to have various different kinds of accounts removed. And it's perfectly possible, and I think actually it's quite likely, that a proxy for the things that users don't really want. Most users don't like people sending them vaccine denial posts when they post about COVID. Most people don't like getting that. It reduces the quality of their Twitter experience to have that kind of content sent to them. Just as Tom gave that good example of the kind of QAnon person bounding into your baby pictures. Personally, I think I would like Twitter to also try to make my experience as good as possible by, if I want to not see QAnon people sending me their theories when I post pictures of like food that I've cooked, things like that. I think it's good if Twitter finds that that's what users want and moderates or censors. I don't need to use a euphemism for it. Censors the kind of content that makes me not enjoy using Twitter. I think it would be bad, and it would be evidence of monopoly positions if Twitter was not responding to user demand in that way. So to kind of summarize, the third possibility is that they're doing this because users want it. And there are diseconomies of scale that come from having 400 million users, that come from, a million of those, or one in 100 of those might be pretty nasty or annoying people. And I don't want to be using a social network with annoying people. And one reaction to that diseconomy of scale is just banning people and removing them from the platform. To me, if that's what users want, then great, let them have it.
What do you make of that, Tom? I'm skeptical of that being how we should be viewing these platforms.
I think a lot of what Sam is describing there are sorts of things that if you don't want to see certain types of content on some of these very large platforms, you don't have to see that kind of content without it affecting the ability of those people to post. You know, you can block certain words, you can block certain accounts, you can mute certain things. I think a lot of this discussion centers around the ability of certain individuals to even have accounts, to have access, full stop. We're not saying they've got a right to be heard by everyone or that everyone has to listen. But that seems to me to be where there is more of attention in relation to that. And again, I think that the issue that we kind of have to deal with here is the fact that I can completely understand the concerns about the involvement of the state or a regulator in relation to these platforms. You look at some of the things which have already happened. So the NetzDG law in Germany, which was introduced a few years ago, basically compelling companies to take down illegal content. Of course, what we see as a result of that is Facebook being incredibly cautious, taking down things which are satirical posts, left, right, and centre. And again, it creating basically outsourcing state censorship to the private sector. Similarly, if you look at some of the proposals which are now coming out of the European Union, again, it's about effectively compelling these companies to be effectively kind of another arm of the state in relation to clamping down on speech that they have decided is wrong. You see an even worse example of that, arguably, in the online harms paper, which has been mooted, which again is talking about a regulator compelling companies to take down content which isn't even necessarily illegal, which is something which is a whole kind of brave new world of this stuff. But at the same time, you're seeing proposals which are pushing things in a different direction. There's been certain people in big tech who again have talked about, with some accounting for, you know, the scale of platforms, etc., but for trying to introduce kind of First Amendment free speech principles to platforms when they reach a certain size, which again is getting into a discussion of not saying this company must take this thing down that we've decided, but saying that there should be restrictions on what they can take down if they're of a sufficient size. You saw a proposal which came out of Poland, of all places. This is not to suggest that's a very liberal administration by any stretch of the imagination, and I'm sure when that bill comes to light there'll be many things in it which are actually quite bad. But the idea in aspect is to suggest that when you have these companies, again of the size of a Facebook, which are censoring speech which a democratic state and its representatives have decided should be allowed to be said, then therefore there should be some pressure on them to not take that kind of content down. These are ideas that I think could be worth exploring. There's pitfalls with all of this, of course. There is the ultimate danger that people who are the people drafting this kind of legislation, and it is pretty much true that most people who want to talk about regulating the internet, breaking up the big tech firms or whatever, want to do it in part because they want to clamp down on hate speech, misinformation, and all the rest of it. But I think it's a conversation that is at least worth having because there's some interesting distinctions that we can draw in that.
Can I respond on just this?
Yeah, of course.
I thought your point about the QAnon person coming in was really good, because I think it's a really good example of the user experience being degraded on a kind of a small site by just having somebody irrelevant and annoying coming in and bothering them. Where I think we disagree is that I think that the user experience is degraded on a big site if that happens as well. And you know, it's true you can block those people, but if everybody would like to block those people, then maybe it's better for everybody and maybe it's easier for them all if the site just says we're just going to block those people by default and you can go to another website if you don't want to get that kind of content. I think that's basically what's going on here, and I find that much less troubling. And really, I think that, you know, YouTube is an example. YouTube doesn't allow pornography. Maybe I mean, that is a restriction on freedom of speech. Maybe it's not a very important one politically, but it is a restriction on freedom of speech. I think it's probably good for the user experience. I imagine most people using YouTube are happier that it doesn't allow pornography. And I don't think it's that hard to imagine that they might feel the same way about, you know, Holocaust denial videos or, you know, other anti-vax videos, which again is a restriction on the freedom of speech of the people who want to produce those videos. But they can go elsewhere, and the user experience of everybody else is improved by not having that content on the platform.
I'm not sure if there is a general view of who should be, you know, cancelled from these websites that can sort of be decided in that fashion. You know, if X amount of people have blocked one person, I'm not sure that's a good reasoning.
That's for the platform owner to decide. The platform owner decides that because they compete with other platforms for users. And if they make the wrong decision, then users will go to another platform that hasn't made that decision. You know, with the Parler point, what was interesting was that all of these companies made this decision at the same time. independently. Now, if they didn't make it independently, that may change things, and that may even be illegal under US antitrust law. But they seem to have come to this decision independently. I think I agree with the decision, and I think they've made the right decision. It's the fact that all of these different companies, including lots of hosting companies, but not all made this decision simultaneously. That seems to me to be evidence that they have some other reason. There is an outside event, in this case, the storming of the US Capitol by people who had been using Parler and being egged on by people in Parler, that has caused these companies to decide it's in our business interest to not serve this website. We could make money from it, but we're going to lose more money elsewhere if we do that. To me, that's the market working, and I think the market working quite well. And again, I have to remind, I think Tom is really completely right to make a distinction between, the legal right to speech, which I think we're all on the same page about, and then the second question about, how much can we express our views, because it's not at all clear what the law, how far the law should go in sort of upholding that or promoting that. I agree that, it would be great if everybody was happy to hear lots of challenging views all the time. And I think that anti-vaxxers and Holocaust deniers should always be able to get a platform of some kind if they want to. I hate those people, but it's important that everybody can express their views. What I disagree, and where I think that some people go too far, is to think that there is a legal that the law should go even further, that it shouldn't just constrain the state, it should constrain private actors and private businesses and private platforms in their ability to moderate the things that they have built and their own property. That's where I think we get into really difficult and I think very dangerous ground.
I have some thoughts on that, but I know that Marc has been dutifully listening to me and Sam ring for a few minutes.
Marc, do you want to come in on that at all?
Well, a very specific point, and again, I haven't really wrapped my brain around it sufficiently. But and again, the three of you might help to unclog my mind on this, and that is the particular case. The case I'm interested in is the one of Darren Grimes and his interview with David Starkey, when the police were going to feel Darren's collar, not because of something he had actually said, but because he had published or recorded and then relayed his interview with David Starkey, and it was on the basis of the words that David Starkey had used, and there's a separate debate as to concerning the actual content of what Starkey said. But in that situation, it's not, the relationship here is not just between the big tech platforms and those sites they are hosting, but the interesting aspect of that case was the state itself intervening in terms of something that had been recorded. So I don't know where you guys stand on that, or what are the implications of the police wanting to intervene directly in that situation?
I think that is a very alarming point, and it points to something that we can all agree on, which is that state censorship is horrendous, and the extent of it in this country is deplorable from a free speech perspective. Of course it is, but I think in a sense, that's something which is subject to some measure of democratic control and campaigning. I think the difficulty with when you're talking about these big tech companies is that they are, at the end of the day, unaccountable. And on Sam's point of the extent to which they're in response to kind of what is, broadly speaking, the kind of opinion of the users, we're effectively relying on these companies to kind of discern the general will of their users and to decide what the limits are on that basis, which can be quite difficult. The other thing about it is that if you look at some of the things that they are beginning to censor, I refuse to believe that most users want this stuff censored. Like, for instance, one thing which is increasing an issue with Twitter, less so with Facebook, but I think it's heading that direction, is discussions around gender identity. So under Twitter's hateful conduct policy, you can be suspended for life, as Megan Murphy, a Canadian radical feminist, was a few years ago, for misgendering or dead naming someone, which, again, you might disagree as to the kind of question of gender identity, full stop. But if you're even talking about kind of news stories, in Megan Murphy's case, she was discussing a trans woman who was also an alleged sex offender and referring to them in the gender in which you believe this person was booted off for life from this issue. And whilst the polling on the question of something like gender identity is a little bit mixed, I still cannot believe that there's an overwhelming majority of people who do not think along similar lines to someone like Meghan Murphy. So that complicates the narrative just a little bit. And I also think the thing that we've got to recognise, and I don't really know how to place this, is particularly in the US context, is the relationship between the political elite and kind of Silicon Valley in the form of the Democratic Party, where you've had a lot of this kind of saber rattling from Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, other people in Congress on the Democratic side for a long time for them to clamp down on hate speech, misinformation, even calls from their side to repeal Section 230 or whatever. There was also a revolving door between Silicon Valley and the Obama administration. Look at the Biden administration, it seems like a lot of people from these big tech firms are also going to be there. There is a troubling relationship there where you basically have the kind of values and the political imperatives of one section of American politics having a direct influence on these unilateral decisions made by these big companies. That's a problem. And again, whilst we should be ultimately the most vigilant in relation to issues of state censorship, those are ones which are more directly accountable to us. The issue with big tech, not to suggest that being banned from Twitter is the same as being locked up, but at the same time it's important. And also what's important is the extent to which you have this kind of muddying where, in a sense, a form of state censorship, if you like, is kind of just outsourced to the public sector through these kinds of connections. And that's something that we're going to see more and more of, or is at least going to be more and more of a question, I think, with this incoming administration.
Before we finish, unless there's anyone would like to add anything else on that point.
I will. I know I've spoken so much, but I'm trying to exercise my free speech rights as much as I can here, given that I can. I think to clarify my point, I don't think that the platforms are trying to find out what a majority of their users want. They're trying to weigh up the preferences of different groups of users, sometimes very, very strong preferences held by a minority or a small number of users where other users just don't care. So I agree that it's terrible. I really, really, really strongly disagree with Twitter's policy on gender identity debates. I really strongly do. Without getting into that, I think it's completely plausible that a relatively small, maybe 20 or 10% of users, young people, people for whom it's kind of completely obvious that dead naming somebody or misgendering somebody is just terrible. It's just one of the worst things you can do. I don't agree with them, but I know a lot of people, particularly younger people, who do think that. And I know that it's a very common belief. I think it's completely possible that the other 80% of Twitter users just do not care. And so Twitter rationally, and I think as a kind of completely sensible business decision, has said, well, we want to keep this 20% of really passionate users happy. We don't really care that much about this tiny minority of 1% of users that we're going to, or 0.1% of users that we're going to kick off. Everybody else doesn't really seem to care very much, or maybe 5% or 10% of people don't agree but don't disagree that much that they're going to leave the platform. So it's kind of a weighing off of those sort of preferences and costs and benefits. I don't agree. I wish. I would make a different decision. I would like the platform to do differently, and stuff like that is a reason to go to another platform. But I don't think it's a simple question of sort of just counting up majority minority. That's one of the advantages of platforms, and that's one of the advantages of private businesses, because when it comes to state regulation and decisions made by the state, there is no way of measuring intensity of preference. All you can do is count up the number of yeses and count up the number of noes. So minorities with strongly held preferences, which are often completely legitimate preferences and good preferences, can get ignored and kind of run roughshod. That's the story of the state running roughshod over people with unpopular opinions. So I think that I'm much more concerned about states trying to make rules about kind of anything, because I don't think that state accountability is that good, because ultimately the state is just accountable to 51% of the population. It can completely ignore the remaining 49% or 5% or 10% in the minority. That's the reason that I'm very skeptical of voice. I don't think voice is a great way of changing things. And so I'm even though a lot of my life revolves around trying to get states to do things differently, I'm very, very pessimistic about our actual ability to do that in an effective way, although often we have no choice. I'm much more optimistic about exit. I think exit, leaving a service or leaving a kind of an organization that has bad policies and going to a different one that has policies that you like, is a much more effective way of getting yourself into a position that you want to be in. And so that's why it always comes back for me to this question of kind of basically how much of a monopolist over the thing that we care about is the service we're talking about. Much more concerned about I think Visa and MasterCard, just as examples, are much more like, they have much more like a monopoly hold on the sort of part of the market that they're talking about, and much more power to kind of effect true censorship, where we really just are silencing a voice that just nobody can hear anymore, compared to a service like Twitter, which in the market that I think matters, which is the market for expressing ideas in this context, I think Twitter really does not have a controlling share. I think it has a tiny kind of trivial share, and even the kind of big tech platforms collectively, I think, still have a fairly small share compared to the World Wide Web, compared to people's ability to self-publish, and so on. So I think that's kind of the best way I can explain this reason to prefer Exit, because you can always go even to a crappy site, you can still do it and run it, compared to Voice, where if you're in the minority and if you're on the wrong side, you just have no other option at all.
So on that note, thank you all for joining me. It seems there are no easy solutions to this big question, but we'll see what happens with the new Biden administration and in the weeks, months, years to come. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. You can also listen to this broadcast on Podbean, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Thanks for watching.